Hello and welcome back to another video for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies Philosophy Theme 1. Today we're continuing to look at the ontological arguments by looking at some of the developments of the ontological arguments. So the first development we'll look at is Descartes' version of the ontological argument. So the modern French philosopher René Descartes formulated his ontological argument in his book The Meditations, which is based on his rationalist epistemology, which basically means that he taught that truths about God and existence could be known a priori by reason alone. So this is in contrast with empirical or empiricist epistemology propagated by people like David Hume and John Locke, which states that our knowledge comes from the senses. Descartes, on the other hand, taught that actually we can know things a priori by using reason alone. And so therefore he's going to find the ontological argument, especially Anselm's version, quite attractive because all it requires is your brain and it's a bit of logic, right? So he's offering a different version of the argument, but it's similar in a certain way to Anselm's argument. And if you don't know what that Anselm's argument is, do watch the video entitled 1D Origins of the Ontological Argument. We're looking at 1E, which is a development of it and different versions of it. Because remember that there's not one ontological argument, there's not one cosmological or one teleological argument. There are different ones proposed by different philosophers and different theologians. Okay, so Descartes' version starts by defining God in positive terms as the most perfect being, or in other words, the being which possesses all perfections. So a perfection is the best form of any possible attribute. So let's take the attribute of love, for example. The perfection of love is omnibenevolence, right? Loving without any hatred or malice, loving totally and fully, right? And so God is that being which possesses all perfections. So every positive attribute he has to its maximum, okay? So that means that God is the supremely perfect being. And since he's a supremely perfect being, he's not only all-powerful, he's not only powerful, but he's all-powerful, right? And he's not only knowledgeable, but omniscient, meaning he knows everything. As well as these typical attributes of the God of classical theism, so all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, etc., Descartes reckons that existence itself is another perfection, since it's more perfect to exist than not to exist. Okay, that's another controversial claim, so bear that in mind. But, you know, if God possesses the perfection of love, the perfection of knowledge, the perfection of power, then he also possesses the possession of the perfection. Forgive me, there's a lot of P words there. Possesses the perfection of existence, right? So because God possesses all perfections, and existence is a perfection, therefore God possesses the perfection of existence. Okay? And if God possesses the perfection of existence, then God, as the supremely perfect being, exists. Okay? And that is effectively it, right? As in, he's saying, basically, God is the perfect being, he has all the perfections, existence is the perfection, therefore God exists. There we go. But he does elucidate his argument further by using two analogies. The first analogy is the idea of a triangle. Now, when we think of a triangle, it has a part of its essence, so like what it is, the very nature of a triangle, is the quality of three angles. Okay, if it didn't have three angles, then it would cease to be a triangle. So the property of three angles makes a triangle a triangle. This isn't to say that a triangle or a particular triangle exists in reality, but if it did, it would have to have three angles, and if it didn't, it would be something else. Now, let's apply that to God. Right, when one thinks of God, one of his essential characteristics is existence. You don't think of God and think, oh, this is a God who does not exist. You think of God as existing, right? As he is the supremely perfect being. If you were to think of God as not existing, you wouldn't be thinking of God. So just as a triangle needs three angles to be a triangle, part of an essence of a triangle is the fact that it has three angles, part of the essence of God is existence. So God needs to exist in order to be God, if that makes sense. So it's part of God's essence is his existence. The second analogy he gives is that of mountains and valleys. So this is basically the idea that when we think of a mountain, we cannot but think of its corresponding valley. Since by definition, a mountain is always accompanied by a valley. Okay, you don't have a mountain without a valley, right? So just as you can't separate the idea of a valley from a mountain, you cannot separate or divorce the idea of existence from God. God, because he's a supremely perfect being, has to exist. And the idea of existence is natural to him. It's part of his essence. Okay? So to summarize Descartes' argument, he says that God alone possesses the perfection of a necessary existence, a similarity postologian 3 for Anselm, as he is a supremely perfect being. Okay? So we can see how Descartes' argument has a lot of similarities with Anselm's argument, but do be careful not to mix them up and to know exactly what words he uses, the phrases. So Descartes defines God as a supremely perfect being, whereas Anselm describes him as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So there are some differences, but they both agree that God has to exist and has a necessary existence because he is the greatest possible being. Okay. The other ontological argument we'll look at is Malcolm's version. Okay, so Malcolm, or Norman Malcolm, is a modern philosopher from America who revived the ontological arguments of Anselm and Descartes in his article for the Philosophical Review of 1960. So it's quite a recent argument in comparison to Anselm, who wrote in the 11th century, and Descartes in the, I believe it was the 17th century. Okay, and so what Norman Malcolm's doing is he's reviving them and also developing the argument and strengthening it in response to objections. So in the next video, we'll look at the objections to the ontological argument. And so Norman Malcolm is actually responding, no, I think the argument can still stand up to scrutiny. Okay, so he looks at Anselm's argument, first of all, in Proslogion 2, and he rejects Anselm's definition of God. So remember that in Proslogion 2, Anselm describes God as that in which nothing greater can be conceived. And Malcolm does take an issue with that, so he doesn't like that. He also rejects Descartes' definition of God as the supremely perfect being. Remember, we've just looked at that, okay? Instead, he prefers the definition of necessary existence that Anselm gives in Proslogion 3. So God isn't that in which nothing greater can be conceived, or the supremely perfect being. He finds that language too problematic. But instead, God is the being with necessary existence, okay? So he expands upon Anselm's definition by giving his own. He defines God as an unlimited being, meaning he has no limits whatsoever, right? That's simply what it means, right? No limits to God. This means he possesses all perfections, similarly to Descartes, and is worthy of worship, and there are no limits to his power, love, knowledge, or any other attribute. As if there were, then he would cease to be unlimited, and thereby cease to be God. So the definition of God is that he's unlimited, and so he cannot not exist, because if he didn't exist, then he would be limited, or he wouldn't have any unlimits, as you could say, and so therefore he cannot not exist, right? He's necessary. Now Malcolm claims that there are only two options. Either God exists, either there is an unlimited being, or there isn't, right? If God exists, he must be necessary, as because he's unlimited, he couldn't be contingent, as being contingent would make him dependent on something else for his existence, and that can't really work because he's unlimited, right? He's not bound by anything else. Or, if God doesn't exist, then he's actually impossible. But these are the only two choices. Either God is necessary or impossible. Okay? The only way that God's existence could be impossible would be if the concept of God, if we were to think of it and logically sort of dissect it, if that concept is logically incoherent or self-contradictory. Like, for example, a four-sided triangle. What on earth is a four-sided triangle? Or a square circle, right? We can't think of those things and they don't exist because they are impossible, right? And so the idea of God is equally impossible, then we can reject it as an impossible thing. God cannot exist at all. But since there is no logical inconsistency in the idea of God, according to Malcolm, it follows that his existence is not impossible. And remember, the only two options were that God's existence is impossible or it's necessary. Because as we've just seen, it's not impossible, therefore God's existence as an unlimited being is necessary. So, those are the three main ontological arguments we've looked at. We looked at Anselm in the previous video, and today we've looked at Descartes and Malcolm and their expansions of this argument, okay? Now, it might be important maybe to make like a table or a comparison document which contains a clear outline of what each of these three authors has proposed in their arguments, because there are, of course, very many similarities. They all come to the same conclusion, but they use different language, different definitions of God, different processes of reasoning, and so it's important to know how each of those arguments differ. But I hope that's helped to sketch and outline the different ontological arguments. Thank you very much.